For 13 long years, a retired cavalry veteran believed his beloved warhorse was gone forever. But when a surprising call reunites him with the animal that once saved his life, he discovers that Hero, now frail and dying, still has one final mission. Together, they embark on a journey that transforms not just the veteran's life, but an entire community. What does this horse do in his final days that leaves everyone speechless? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Jacob Johnson's living room window, barely illuminating the cluttered space he called home. Dust particles danced in the thin beams of light that managed to slip through the partially closed blinds. At 65, Jacob's movements had grown slower, more deliberate, as he reached for his coffee pot with trembling hands. His worn recliner creaked as he settled into its familiar embrace. Around him, the walls told stories of his past, through faded photographs and military medals that hung slightly crooked. In the corner, a saddle collected dust, its leather cracked with age and neglect. The coffee splashed slightly over the rim as he poured, his hands refusing to steady themselves today. The bitter aroma helped ground him, a daily ritual that kept the memories at bay. Memories of gunfire, of thundering hooves, of brothers lost. The sharp ring of his telephone cut through the silence like a bullet, making him flinch. Jacob rarely received calls these days, preferring his solitude. He stared at the phone for 3 rings before finally reaching over to answer it. "Mr. Johnson?" A woman's voice, warm but unfamiliar. "This is Sarah Mitchell from Happy Meadows Animal Sanctuary." Jacob's throat tightened. "Yes?" "Mr. Johnson, I believe we have your horse here. Hero. We found his military registration number, and it led us to you." The coffee cup trembled in Jacob's hand. Hero. A name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, though it echoed in his dreams often enough. "That's impossible," Jacob said gruffly. "Hero was sold off after the war. That was 15 years ago." "Yes, we've traced his history," Sarah continued gently. "He's quite elderly now, Mr. Johnson, and his health is failing. We thought you might want to see him." Jacob's eyes drifted to the shelf where a photograph sat in a simple wooden frame, a younger version of himself in uniform, standing beside a proud bay horse with a white star on his forehead. His chest tightened. "No," he said firmly. "You must be mistaken. I'm not interested." He hung up before Sarah could respond. The silence felt heavier now. Jacob's coffee had grown cold, forgotten in his trembling grip. He couldn't tear his eyes away from that photograph, from Hero's intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through him, even in print. As midnight approached, sleep eluded him. Jacob found himself pulling out an old wooden box from under his bed, its hinges protesting as he opened it. Inside lay carefully preserved memories, his service medals, old letters, a worn cavalry guidebook. His fingers brushed against something metal. Hero's brass nameplate, dulled with age, but still legible. He ran his thumb over the engraved letters, remembering how it had gleamed on Hero's bridle. The weight of it in his palm seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. "Just a check," he muttered to himself, setting the nameplate on his nightstand. "Just to make sure they're wrong." The steering wheel felt cold under Jacob's grip as he guided his old pickup down the country roads toward Happy Meadows Animal Sanctuary. The morning fog hung low over the fields, reminding him of another morning long ago when Hero had carried him through similar mist to rescue 2 wounded soldiers. His hands tightened on the wheel. The memories came in waves now. Hero standing steady under gunfire. Hero pushing through exhaustion to get them to safety. Hero's warm breath against his neck during quiet moments between battles. 3 times during the drive, Jacob pulled over to the shoulder, his heart racing as he considered turning back. "This is crazy," he muttered, but each time he found himself pulling back onto the road, drawn forward by something stronger than his fear. The sanctuary's gravel driveway crunched under his tires as he parked near a weathered barn. Sarah, a woman in her 40s wearing mud-stained boots and a kind smile, met him at the entrance. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Johnson," she said softly, leading him past various paddocks. "He's just around this corner." Jacob stopped dead in his tracks. There, in a quiet paddock bordered by old oak trees, stood what remained of his warhorse. Hero's once gleaming bay coat had faded to a dull brown, hanging loosely over protruding ribs. His proud neck now drooped, and scars marked his flanks. The sight hit Jacob like a physical blow. "I can't," he whispered, taking a step backward. "I can't do this." But then Hero's ears pricked forward. The old horse lifted his head, nostrils flaring as he caught Jacob's scent. With slow, stiff steps, he made his way to the fence. Jacob stood frozen as Hero stretched out his neck and gently nudged his shoulder. The same gesture he'd used thousands of times during the war, asking for treats or attention. Jacob's carefully constructed walls crumbled. His hand shook as he reached up to stroke Hero's neck, feeling the familiar warmth beneath the coarse hair. Tears he'd held back for years spilled down his weathered cheeks. "His condition is deteriorating," Sarah explained gently. "The vet diagnosed him with a degenerative disease. We're making him comfortable, but," she paused, "he probably has only a few months left." Jacob barely heard her. He was already climbing through the fence, settling himself in the soft grass beside Hero. The old horse lowered himself carefully to the ground next to him, their shoulders touching just like they used to during quiet nights in the field. They sat together as the sun traced its path across the sky, Jacob occasionally sharing quiet words about their shared past. As evening approached and the air grew cool, he turned to Sarah, who had been discreetly checking on them throughout the day. "I'm taking you home," he told Hero, his voice rough but determined. Jacob spent 3 days preparing his old barn, working from sunrise to sunset. His muscles protested with each movement, reminding him he wasn't the young cavalry soldier he used to be. Cobwebs draped every corner like gray curtains, and the roof had 2 spots that leaked when it rained. The work was hard, but necessary. "Come on, old man," he muttered to himself, climbing the ladder to patch the roof. His knee creaked with each step, but he pressed on. He remembered how Hero had once carried him for miles after he'd been shot in the leg. The least he could do was make sure the horse had a dry place to rest. He transformed an open space into a comfortable stall, measuring twice before hammering each board into place. The physical labor left him exhausted, but it felt good to use his hands again, to have a purpose. As he swept the floor, he found himself humming an old cavalry tune he hadn't thought about in years. When the trailer pulled up his driveway, Jacob's heart raced. Sarah stepped out first, followed by Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian. They lowered the ramp, and Jacob held his breath as Hero backed carefully out of the trailer. The old horse's head swung from side to side, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Easy there, buddy," Jacob said softly, approaching with slow, deliberate steps. Hero's ears swiveled toward his voice, and the tension in the horse's frame eased slightly. Jacob gripped the lead rope, surprised by how natural it felt in his hand after all these years. He guided Hero toward the barn, speaking quietly the whole time. Dr. Martinez followed them inside, carrying a medical kit. "Here's his medication schedule," she said, handing Jacob a detailed list. "The blue pills are for inflammation, the white ones for pain. He'll need them twice daily with food." Now, Jacob pulled out a small notebook and wrote everything down in careful, precise letters. His hand trembled slightly, but his writing was clear. "What about his feed?" he asked. Small portions 4 times daily, the vet explained. Mix this supplement in with his morning meal. Watch for signs of discomfort or loss of appetite. After Sarah and the vet left, Jacob settled onto a bale of hay, watching Hero explore his new home. The horse's breathing filled the quiet barn with a steady rhythm. Moonlight filtered through the window, casting a gentle glow over Hero's silver-flecked coat. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jacob felt the knot of anxiety in his chest begin to loosen. He sat there in the peaceful darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of a horse at rest, and found himself breathing in sync with Hero. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when Jacob limped to the barn, carrying Hero's carefully measured feed. The old routine felt both familiar and strange, like putting on a uniform that no longer quite fit. He pushed open the barn door, and Hero's soft nickering greeted him. "Morning, old friend," Jacob said, his voice rough from disuse. He measured the medicine exactly as Dr. Martinez had shown him, mixing the pills into Hero's feed. The horse ate slowly, taking careful bites while Jacob stood nearby, watching every mouthful. As Hero ate, Jacob found himself talking, the words coming easier than they had in years. "Remember that time in Mason Valley?" he said, leaning against the stall door. "That thunderstorm came out of nowhere. You got us both to safety, even though you were scared too." Hero's ears flicked back and forth, seeming to listen. "Never met another horse as brave as you." By midday, Jacob's hands were stiff and sore from mucking out the stall and carrying water buckets. Each movement reminded him that he wasn't the strong young soldier he'd once been. But Hero's gentle presence made the work worthwhile, even when his joints protested. The crunch of gravel announced an unexpected visitor. Hank, his neighbor from down the road, appeared in the barn doorway, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "Heard you got yourself a horse," Hank said, peering into the stall. His eyebrows rose as he took in Hero's thin frame and dull coat. "Looks pretty rough, Jacob." "You sure you can handle this? Must be a lot of work for someone your age." Jacob's jaw tightened. "He's not just any horse," he said firmly. "We served together. He saved my life more times than I can count." "Still," Hank persisted, "he looks like he needs a lot of care. Maybe the sanctuary would be better equipped." "I can manage," Jacob cut him off, perhaps more sharply than necessary. But Hank's words had struck a nerve, feeding the doubts that had been gnawing at him. After a simple dinner of canned soup, Jacob returned to the barn. The evening air was cool and still as he brushed Hero's coat with slow, gentle strokes. The repetitive motion soothed them both. Hero's head drooped contentedly, and he leaned into the brush. When Jacob finished, Hero turned and pressed his soft muzzle against Jacob's shoulder. A gesture so familiar made his throat tight with emotion. He adjusted Hero's blanket, making sure it covered him properly for the night. "You're still my hero," Jacob whispered, his voice thick. He gave the horse one final pat before securing the barn door for the night, the key turning with a solid click in the lock. Jacob woke before dawn, his joints protesting as he shifted in bed. Yesterday's work had left him feeling every one of his 60-plus years. He moved carefully to the kitchen, his movements stiff and measured, and started the coffee maker. While it brewed, he stood at the kitchen window, gazing at the barn in the dim morning light. Pride swelled in his chest at having Hero back home, but Hank's words from yesterday echoed in his mind. The physical demands were already taking their toll. Still, the thought of failing Hero again pushed him to move forward. He couldn't let his old friend down, not this time. At the barn, Jacob noticed Hero seemed unusually subdued during their morning routine. The horse's movements were slower, his appetite less eager. Worry gnawed at Jacob's stomach as he reached for his phone and dialed Dr. Martinez. It's normal to see some changes day to day, the vet assured him. Just keep to the routine we discussed. Call me if anything significant changes. Jacob pulled up an old wooden chair near Hero's stall that afternoon. The horse dozed lightly while Jacob's mind drifted back to their time in service. Remember that night in Thompson's Valley? He said softly. We had those 3 wounded men with us. Enemy fire everywhere. His voice grew thick with emotion. You never hesitated. Carried us right through that mess of gunfire and smoke. Never met another horse that brave. Hero's ears twitched at the sound of Jacob's voice. Jacob wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you, old friend. A lot of good men wouldn't be. The weight of that debt settled heavy on his shoulders as he watched Hero's gentle breathing. That evening, Jacob found himself pulling out an old footlocker from under his bed. Inside, carefully preserved, lay his cavalry gear. His fingers brushed over Hero's war medals, the brass still shining after all these years. Beneath them, he found what he was looking for. The cavalry blanket, its fabric worn, but still sturdy. Back in the barn, Jacob shook out the blanket, dust motes dancing in the evening light. He draped it carefully over Hero's back, smoothing it with trembling hands. Hero's ears perked up, and he turned his head toward the familiar fabric, nostrils flaring slightly as if remembering its scent. The horse's reaction brought a smile to Jacob's weathered face, a rare expression these days, but one that felt right in this moment. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jacob's driveway as a small blue sedan pulled up. A woman in her mid-40s, wearing a cardigan and carrying a leather messenger bag, stepped out. She introduced herself as Mrs. Turner from the local elementary school. I heard about your warhorse, Hero, she said, her eyes bright with interest. The children would love to meet him and hear your stories from the cavalry. Jacob's stomach tightened. He shifted uncomfortably on his porch. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I'm not much for public speaking. Those days are behind me now. Just think about it, Mrs. Turner said kindly, leaving her card on the porch railing. The children could learn so much from your experiences. Later that afternoon, Jacob brushed Hero's coat, working out the tangles with gentle strokes. You always did this to me, didn't you? He muttered, pushing me to do things I didn't want to do. Hero turned his head, dark eyes seeming to study Jacob's face. Remember that time I was scared to lead that night patrol? You practically dragged me forward. Jacob's hand stilled on the brush. After a long moment, he pulled out his phone and dialed Mrs. Turner's number. The next morning, Jacob arrived early to prepare Hero for their visit. He took extra care with the grooming, noticing how Hero's coat had regained some of its shine after a few days of proper care. The old cavalry blanket sat proudly on Hero's back, its worn fabric telling its own story of service and sacrifice. When they arrived at the school, children spilled out of the building like eager puppies, their excited chatter filling the air. They gathered around Hero, their small hands reaching out to pat his nose and stroke his neck. Hero stood perfectly still, displaying the patience that had made him such an exceptional warhorse. Jacob cleared his throat nervously as Mrs. Turner introduced him to the class. His hands trembled slightly as he began to speak, but when he looked at Hero, standing tall despite his age and illness, something shifted inside him. This is Hero, he began, his voice growing stronger. He saved my life and the lives of many others during the war. The children sat cross-legged on the grass, their faces turned up to him in rapt attention. As Jacob shared stories of Hero's bravery, of midnight rescues and dangerous missions, he felt the weight of years of silence lifting from his shoulders. Hero's ears perked up at the sound of Jacob's voice, as if he too was remembering those days. When they left the school, Jacob felt lighter than he had in years. The pride he'd once felt in his service, in Hero's service, had awakened again. It wasn't just a burden to carry anymore. It was a story worth telling. The morning after the school visit, Jacob wiped sweat from his forehead as he worked in Hero's stall. The familiar rhythm of mucking out helped ease his aching muscles. The crunch of tires on gravel made him pause. Through the barn door, he saw Mrs. Turner's blue sedan pulling up. But this time, she wasn't alone. A boy climbed out of the passenger seat, his shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed on the ground. He couldn't have been more than 12, with tousled brown hair and worn sneakers that kicked at the dirt as he walked. "Jacob," Mrs. Turner called out warmly, "I hope you don't mind us dropping by. This is Ethan. I thought he might like to meet Hero." Jacob leaned his pitchfork against the wall, studying the boy's downturned face. Mrs. Turner stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Ethan's father served too. He's currently incarcerated. I thought maybe spending time with Hero might help." Jacob's chest tightened. He wasn't good with kids, especially troubled ones. But something in the boy's stance, defensive yet yearning, struck a chord. "Well," Jacob said, clearing his throat, "Hero could use some company." Ethan stayed near the barn entrance, his hands stuffed in his pockets as Jacob led Hero from his stall. The old horse's hooves clicked softly on the concrete floor. "You can come closer," Jacob said. "He won't bite." Ethan took one hesitant step forward, then another. Jacob demonstrated how to hold your hand flat with a carrot, letting Hero lip it gently from your palm. To Jacob's surprise, Hero stretched his neck toward Ethan, nickering softly. The boy's eyes widened as Hero's velvet muzzle touched his shoulder. A small smile cracked Ethan's serious expression. "He's friendly," he whispered. "Want to learn how to brush him?" Jacob asked, reaching for the grooming kit. Ethan nodded eagerly. Jacob showed him how to use the curry comb in circular motions, then the soft brush to sweep away loose hair. Ethan's movements grew more confident with each stroke. Soon he was asking questions about Hero's medals, his training, and his time in the service. "Did he ever get scared?" Ethan asked, working the brush along Hero's neck. "Sure did," Jacob replied. "But being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done anyway." After Mrs. Turner took Ethan home, Jacob settled on a hay bale beside Hero's stall. The barn felt different somehow, less like a sanctuary for just him and Hero, and more like a place of possibility. He watched Hero doze, thinking about Ethan's face when the horse had first nuzzled him. Maybe there was more to this chapter of his life than he'd thought. Maybe caring for Hero wasn't just about paying an old debt or finding peace. Maybe it was about something bigger. Over the next few days, Ethan's visits became a bright spot in Jacob's routine. The boy would arrive after school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes already searching for Hero. Jacob found himself looking forward to these afternoons, watching as Ethan grew more confident around the old horse. "Like this?" Ethan asked, carefully measuring Hero's feed, while Jacob nodded approvingly. "Perfect. You're getting good at this," Jacob said. He showed Ethan how to mix Hero's medication into the feed, explaining why each scoop and pill mattered. The boy absorbed everything, his face serious with concentration. During grooming sessions, Hero would lean into Ethan's brush strokes, his eyes half closed in contentment. Jacob noticed how the horse's ears would perk up at the sound of Ethan's voice, how he seemed more animated during the boy's visits. One afternoon, while they worked together cleaning Hero's stall, Ethan paused, leaning on his pitchfork. "Mr. Johnson?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Why is Hero so old and sick?" Jacob set down his own fork, considering his words carefully. The boy deserved honesty, but finding the right words wasn't easy. "Well, Ethan, Hero's lived a long life. He's getting close to the end of it now. Like all living things, horses don't live forever." Ethan's face fell, but his jaw set with determination. "Can we make Hero happy?" he asked. "You know, for the time he has left." The question caught Jacob off guard. He looked at Ethan's earnest expression, then at Hero dozing in the corner of his stall. The boy's compassion touched something deep in Jacob's heart. "Yes," Jacob said softly. "Yes, I think we can do that." That evening, after Ethan had gone home, Jacob sat at his kitchen table with a notepad. He began writing, his pen scratching against the paper. "Things to make Hero happy." Jacob studied the list, adding more items as they came to mind. When he finished, he walked out to the barn and pinned it to the wall near Hero's stall. The old horse nickered softly as Jacob patted his neck. For the first time since Hero had returned to his life, Jacob felt truly hopeful. This wasn't just about waiting for the inevitable anymore. It was about making each day count. The morning sun painted long shadows across the pasture as Jacob and Ethan led Hero out of his stall. They had the list in hand, ready to start making Hero's days special. Ethan held the lead rope carefully, just as Jacob had taught him, while Hero plodded along beside them. "Easy now," Jacob said, watching as Ethan guided Hero toward a patch of fresh grass. "Let him take his time." Hero's ears perked forward at the sight of the green grass, and he lowered his head to graze. Though his movements were slow, his eyes brightened at being outdoors. "Look, Mr. Johnson, he seems happier already," Ethan said, beaming as Hero contentedly munched the grass. Later that morning, Jacob brought out several old barrels from the barn and some rope. He arranged them in a simple pattern across the pasture, creating a basic obstacle course. "What's all this for?" Ethan asked, helping Jacob position the last barrel. Back in his cavalry days, Hero was trained to navigate all sorts of obstacles, Jacob explained. "This'll give him some gentle exercise and help him remember the good times." Ethan's eyes widened with interest. Was he really brave during the war? "Bravest horse I ever knew," Jacob replied, adjusting the rope between two barrels. "Once carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire." They took turns leading Hero through the course. The old horse moved slowly but deliberately, picking his way between the barrels as Ethan encouraged him. "Good boy, Hero," Ethan cheered when they completed the course. "You did it." Jacob watched from the fence, noting how Hero's steps seemed more purposeful. His head held a little higher. The horse was responding to Ethan's enthusiasm, showing glimpses of his former spirit. As the afternoon wound down, Jacob and Ethan sat on the bottom rail of the fence, watching Hero graze peacefully in the golden light. The old horse had earned his rest after the day's activities. "Mr. Johnson," Ethan asked, his legs swinging gently, "can we keep working on Hero's list together? I want to help make all his days special." Jacob looked at the boy beside him, seeing the genuine care in his expression. "I'd like that, Ethan. I think Hero would too." In that quiet moment, watching Hero with Ethan by his side, Jacob felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about giving Hero a peaceful retirement anymore. Through Hero, he'd found something unexpected, a chance to be a mentor, to make a difference in someone else's life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the barnyard as Ethan trudged up the gravel path, his shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the ground. Jacob noticed right away that something was wrong. The boy usually bounded up to the barn with eager energy. "Hey there," Jacob said softly, but Ethan just gave a small nod and headed straight for Hero's stall. They worked in silence, brushing Hero's coat and checking his hooves. Ethan's movements were mechanical, lacking his usual enthusiasm. Several times, Jacob caught him wiping his eyes with his sleeve, but he didn't press the issue. He remembered being that age, how sometimes you needed space to sort through your feelings. As they moved on to cleaning Hero's stall, Ethan's hands trembled while carrying a bucket of feed. The bucket slipped from his grasp, spilling oats across the freshly swept floor. "I'm sorry," Ethan blurted out, his voice cracking. "I'm so stupid. I can't do anything right." "Hey now, it's just some spilled feed," Jacob said gently. "We can clean it up, no harm done." That's when the dam broke. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he slumped against the stall wall. "It's not just the feed," he sobbed. "I mess everything up. The kids at school. They say I'm going to end up like my dad. In prison. They say I'm worthless." Jacob's heart ached as he watched the boy cry. He lowered himself onto a hay bale, his joints protesting the movement. "Come sit with me for a minute," he said, patting the space beside him. When Ethan settled next to him, Jacob took a deep breath. "You know, when I came back from the war, I felt like a failure too. Couldn't sleep, couldn't hold down a job, couldn't even look people in the eye sometimes." Ethan looked up, surprise cutting through his tears. "Really?" "Really," Jacob nodded. "But then Hero came back into my life. Taking care of him gave me something to focus on, something that mattered. He reminded me that we all have value, even when we don't see it ourselves." "But how do you deal with people saying mean things?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "By focusing on what you can control," Jacob replied. "You can't control what other kids say, but you can control how you spend your time, who you choose to be. Look at how good you are with Hero. That takes patience, dedication, and a kind heart." Ethan reached out to pat Hero's neck, and the old horse nickered softly. A small smile finally broke through the boy's tears. "Thanks, Mr. Johnson, for everything." Jacob watched as Ethan's posture straightened, some of his usual spark returning to his eyes. The way the boy looked at him now, with trust and admiration, filled Jacob with both pride and responsibility. That evening, after Ethan had gone home, Jacob sat at his kitchen table and wrote a simple note. "Keep Hero's lessons alive. For Ethan." The morning sun streamed through Jacob's bedroom window, casting a warm glow across his weathered face. He blinked awake, noting the unusual brightness. After weeks of gray skies and drizzle, the clear blue expanse above promised something special. Over coffee, an idea took root in his mind. He hadn't ridden Hero since bringing him home, but today felt right. When Ethan arrived after school, Jacob shared his plan. "You really think Hero's strong enough?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "We'll take it nice and easy," Jacob replied, retrieving his old saddle from the tack room. "Just a short walk around the yard." Together, they prepared Hero with careful attention. Jacob showed Ethan how to place the saddle pad just right and adjust the straps looser than normal to accommodate Hero's thin frame. The old horse stood quietly, ears perked with interest as they worked. "That's it, boy," Jacob murmured, running his hand along Hero's neck. "Just like old times." With Ethan holding the lead rope, Jacob took a deep breath and put his foot in the stirrup. His joints protested as he swung his leg over, settling gently onto Hero's back. The familiar feeling brought a rush of memories. Countless rides through battlefield smoke, peaceful patrols at sunset, the unshakable trust between horse and rider. Hero shifted uncertainly beneath him, and Jacob leaned forward to pat his neck. "It's okay, old friend. We'll go slow." At first, Hero seemed unsure, his hooves barely lifting off the ground. But with Ethan's gentle guidance and Jacob's soft encouragement, he found his rhythm. Each step was measured and careful, but there was pride in his bearing, as if remembering his glory days. "Look at you guys," Ethan cheered, beaming up at them. "Hero looks like a real cavalry horse now." They made a slow circuit of the barnyard, Hero's stride growing slightly more confident with each step. Jacob couldn't help but smile, feeling the familiar sway of horseback riding that he'd missed for so long. After completing their short journey, Jacob carefully dismounted, his legs slightly shaky. He wrapped his arms around Hero's neck, overwhelmed with emotion. "You've still got it, old friend," he whispered into the horse's mane. "Mr. Johnson?" Ethan's voice was hopeful. "Do you think maybe someday you could teach me to ride Hero?" Jacob looked at the boy's eager face, then at Hero's tired but content expression. "I promise I'll teach you," he said, though his heart grew heavy, knowing Hero's condition was worsening. He kept that worry to himself, focusing instead on Ethan's bright smile and Hero's gentle nickering. The rumble of a truck pulling into Jacob's driveway broke the morning quiet. Through his kitchen window, he spotted Hank's old pickup, its bed loaded with fresh hay bales and bags of feed. Jacob stepped onto his porch, surprised by the unexpected visit. "Thought you could use some supplies," Hank called out, already climbing down from his truck. "Got a good deal at the feed store yesterday." Jacob walked over to help unload, touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to do this, Hank." "Well, I've been watching you with that old war horse," Hank said, hefting a hay bale. "Got to admit, I was wrong about doubting you. Hero's looking better these days." They worked together to stack the hay in the barn, Hero watching them with interest from his stall. When they finished, Jacob invited Hank in for coffee, something he rarely did with anyone. Seated at Jacob's kitchen table, Hank wrapped his weathered hands around his coffee mug. "You know, there's quite a few vets in town who could use something like this," he said thoughtfully. "Tom Williams down at the hardware store. He served in the same war as you. Been having a rough time lately." Jacob shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I don't know, Hank. I'm not really set up for visitors." "Hero makes everyone feel better," Ethan chimed in from where he sat doing his homework. The boy had arrived during their unloading and insisted on staying to help. Hank nodded at Ethan's words. The boy's right. Something special about that horse. Could help some folks who need it, same way he's helping you and Ethan here. Jacob stared into his coffee, the thought of opening his private sanctuary to others making his chest tighten. But he couldn't deny how Hero had changed both his and Ethan's lives. After Hank left and Ethan went home, Jacob spent the evening in the barn with Hero. The old horse seemed especially tired, barely touching his evening feed. Jacob brushed Hero's coat with gentle strokes, worried by his unusual lethargy. "What do you think, old friend?" he murmured, working out a tangle in Hero's mane. "Think we could help some other old soldiers like us?" Hero's only response was a soft exhale as he leaned heavily against his stall door. Jacob pulled up his usual chair, deciding to keep watch over his friend for a while. As night settled in, he thought about Hank's suggestion, weighing his desire to help others against his instinct to keep to himself. "We'll take it slow," he finally whispered to Hero. "Maybe start with just 1 or 2 visitors." But his words trailed off as he noticed Hero's unusual stillness, concern creeping into his thoughts as he settled in for a long night of watching over his faithful companion. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Jacob made his way to the barn. His joints ached more than usual, a reminder of another restless night spent worrying about Hero's health and Hank's suggestion about visitors. As he measured out Hero's morning feed, mixing in the usual medications, Jacob found himself talking softly to the horse. "Don't know if I'm cut out for this, old friend," he muttered, watching Hero's ears twitch at the sound of his voice. "Other people, they might not understand what we've been through." Hero nickered softly, nudging Jacob's shoulder as he poured the feed into the trough. The familiar gesture brought a slight smile to Jacob's weathered face. After ensuring Hero was eating, Jacob pulled out his old flip phone and stared at it. Tom Williams' number was there. Hank had scribbled it on a piece of paper before leaving yesterday. Jacob's thumb hovered over the keypad for several long moments before he finally pressed the numbers. "Hello?" Tom's voice was gruff, cautious. "Tom? This is Jacob Johnson." He cleared his throat. "Hank mentioned you might be interested in meeting my horse. He's an old war horse, like us." There was a long pause on the other end. "Don't know much about horses," Tom finally said. "Neither did I before the cavalry," Jacob replied. "Would you consider stopping by later this week? No pressure, just might do us both some good." After some hesitation, Tom agreed to visit on Thursday. Later that morning, Ethan arrived with his usual enthusiasm, carrying a book about horse care he'd borrowed from the school library. "Did you call him?" the boy asked immediately, his eyes bright with excitement. Jacob nodded, measuring out supplements the vet had recommended for boosting Hero's energy. "Thursday," he said simply. "Can I help get Hero ready?" Ethan asked, already reaching for the grooming brushes. "We could make him look extra nice." "Sure," Jacob agreed, watching as Ethan began carefully brushing Hero's coat. The boy's gentle touch seemed to soothe the old horse, who had been more lethargic lately. As evening approached, Jacob sat on his porch, nursing a cup of coffee. In the pasture, Hero grazed slowly, his movements careful but steady. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grass, and Jacob felt the familiar mix of anxiety and hope stirring in his chest. He watched as Hero lifted his head, ears forward, surveying his surroundings with the alertness that had saved so many lives during the war. Maybe that's what Tom needed to see. Not just an old horse, but a fellow soldier who had found peace despite his scars. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup. Thursday seemed both too far away and too close. But watching Hero's quiet strength in the fading light, he felt a flicker of certainty that he was doing the right thing. The morning of Tom's visit dawned clear and cool. Jacob arrived at the barn earlier than usual, his stomach tight with nerves. He had just started sweeping when he heard the crunch of bicycle tires on gravel. "I came to help," Ethan called out, practically jumping off his bike before it stopped. His backpack bounced against his shoulder as he rushed into the barn. Jacob handed him a brush. Hero could use a good grooming. They worked side by side in comfortable silence. Ethan carefully brushed Hero's coat until it gleamed, while Jacob tidied the barn. He laid fresh hay in neat piles and organized the feed bins, checking his watch every few minutes. "Do you think Mr. Tom will like Hero?" Ethan asked, patting Hero's neck. "We'll see," Jacob replied, straightening a saddle blanket for the third time. The sound of a truck engine made them both look up. Through the barn door, they could see a blue pickup pulling into the driveway. Tom stepped out slowly, his posture stiff and uncertain. Jacob walked out to meet him, wiping his palms on his jeans. "Glad you made it, Tom." Tom nodded, his eyes darting around the property. "Nice place you got here." They walked to the barn together, where Hero stood in his freshly cleaned stall. The old horse's ears perked forward at the sight of the visitor, and before anyone could speak, he stretched his neck out and gently nudged Tom's hand. Tom's eyes widened in surprise. "Well, hello there," he said softly, his tense shoulders relaxing slightly. Jacob brought out 2 wooden chairs, setting them near the paddock. As they sat down, Ethan led Hero out into the enclosed space, letting him walk freely. "Served in the 3rd Battalion," Tom said after a while, watching Hero move around the paddock. Jacob nodded. "Hero and I were with the 2nd Cavalry. Saw some rough days together." "Hero saved lots of soldiers," Ethan chimed in, leaning against the fence. "Mr. Jacob told me about the time they rescued a whole patrol under heavy fire." Tom listened intently as Ethan recounted the story, his eyes following Hero's movements. The old horse seemed to sense the importance of the moment, carrying himself with quiet dignity despite his age. When it was time to leave, Tom stood slowly, as if reluctant to break the peaceful atmosphere. "Thank you, Jacob," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Been a long time since I felt this. Settled. Mind if I come back sometime?" "Anytime," Jacob replied. They watched Tom's truck disappear down the driveway. Ethan turned to Jacob with a bright smile. "Hero's helping more people now, isn't he?" Jacob nodded, feeling something warm settle in his chest, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The next morning dawned gray and chilly. Jacob noticed something was off as soon as he entered the barn. Hero's feed bucket from the night before was still half full, unusual for the old horse who typically finished every meal. "Come on, boy," Jacob coaxed, offering Hero a fresh apple. The horse sniffed it, but turned away, concerning Jacob even more. With trembling hands, he dialed the vet's number. "It's not uncommon at this stage," the vet explained gently. "Monitor his eating closely and call me if he refuses 2 meals in a row. But Jacob, you should know his condition might start declining more rapidly now." Jacob's throat tightened as he hung up the phone. Through the barn window, he could see Ethan pedaling up the driveway for his daily visit. The boy's face was bright with excitement, as always. Jacob forced a smile, deciding to keep his worries to himself for now. "Can I take Hero for his walk?" Ethan asked, already reaching for the lead rope. "Of course," Jacob replied, watching them carefully as they headed to the pasture. The morning sun broke through the clouds as Ethan led Hero along their usual path. Jacob stayed close, noticing how Hero's steps seemed more labored than usual. Suddenly, the horse's front legs buckled. Hero stumbled, his whole body swaying dangerously. "Hero!" Ethan cried out in alarm. Jacob rushed forward, pressing his shoulder against Hero's side to help steady him. His heart pounded as he guided the horse back to balance, speaking in low, soothing tones. "What's wrong with him?" Ethan's voice quivered with fear. "He's just a little tired today," Jacob assured him, though his own hands were shaking. "Sometimes old horses have weak moments. Let's get him back to the barn for some rest." That night, after ensuring Hero was comfortable in his stall, Jacob sat at his kitchen table and pulled out a worn leather journal he hadn't touched in years. His handwriting was rough as he began to write, "Hero's not eating well. The vet says it might be time to prepare for what's coming. How do I tell Ethan? The boy loves this horse almost as much as I do now. Today's stumble scared us both, though I tried not to show it. Hero's getting weaker, but his spirit is still strong. He still nuzzles Ethan's pockets for treats and pricks his ears at familiar voices." Jacob paused, wiping moisture from his eyes before continuing, "I promise to make every remaining day count. For Hero, who saved my life in more ways than one. For Ethan, who's just beginning to find his strength. No matter how hard this gets, I won't let either of them down." He closed the journal, listening to the quiet sounds of Hero shifting in his stall through the open window. Each moment felt more precious now, weighted with both love and worry. A few days after Hero's stumble, Hank's pickup truck rumbled up Jacob's driveway. This time he wasn't alone. A woman in her 40s with short dark hair and military posture stepped out of the passenger side. "Jacob, this is Lisa," Hank said. "She served in Afghanistan, worked with military dogs." Lisa nodded stiffly, her eyes darting around the property. Jacob recognized that watchful gaze. He'd seen it in his own mirror countless times. "Hero's just had his morning feed," Jacob said, leading them to the barn. "He's moving a bit slow these days, but his heart's still strong." Ethan was already inside, mixing Hero's medications. His face lit up at the visitors. "Would you like to meet Hero?" he asked Lisa eagerly. Lisa hung back at first, watching as Hero lifted his head to acknowledge the newcomers. Jacob shared stories about their service days, about the times Hero had carried wounded soldiers to safety under fire. "Want to help me groom him?" Ethan offered Lisa a brush. "He loves it when you get right behind his ears." Slowly, Lisa stepped forward and took the brush. As she worked it through Hero's mane, her shoulders began to relax. "He's so gentle," she murmured. Watching Lisa interact with Hero, Jacob felt something click into place. He thought about Tom's visit, about the peace these encounters seemed to bring. After Lisa and Hank left, he pulled out a notepad and started making plans. "What if we did something bigger?" he asked Ethan. "A small gathering to honor cavalry animals, all the horses and dogs who served alongside us." Ethan's eyes widened with excitement. "Like a party for Hero?" "Sort of. We could invite some veterans, their families. Make it special." They spent the afternoon spreading the word. Hank promised to reach out to local veterans groups, while Mrs. Turner offered to announce it at school. Ethan threw himself into making colorful posters, carefully drawing horses and American flags. "Hero's honorary cavalry gathering," he wrote in big letters, tongue stuck out in concentration. Jacob watched as Ethan pinned the posters to the barn wall, Hero standing quietly nearby. The old horse's eyes followed the boy's movements, ears pricked forward with interest. Jacob ran his hand along Hero's neck, feeling the familiar warmth under his palm. "You're bringing everyone together, just like always," he whispered to Hero. Despite his concerns about the horse's declining health, Jacob felt determined to make this event something special, not just for Hero, but for everyone whose lives the old war horse had touched. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jacob's property as he surveyed the work ahead. His usual quiet routine had transformed into a flurry of activity with the upcoming event just a week away. The sound of bicycle tires on gravel announced Ethan's early arrival. "Morning, Mr. Jacob," Ethan called out, practically jumping off his bike. "I brought some decorations from home." He pulled red, white, and blue streamers from his backpack. Jacob smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "Let's start with the basics first. Barn needs a good cleaning." They worked side by side, sweeping away old hay and cobwebs. Ethan chatted about his ideas for the event, while Jacob nodded, secretly wondering if he'd taken on too much. The barn was bigger than he remembered, and his joints ached more with each passing hour. By mid-morning, Jacob's hands trembled as he struggled with a heavy bale of straw. The task of preparing the property suddenly seemed overwhelming. Just then, the familiar rumble of Hank's truck approached. "Thought you could use some help," Hank called out, climbing down from his pickup. He'd brought folding chairs, tables, and more supplies. "Got the Thompson family coming over too. They want to pitch in." Soon, the property buzzed with activity. Mrs. Thompson brought sandwiches, her husband helped set up seating areas, and their teenage sons carried supplies. More neighbors arrived, each bringing something to contribute. Hero watched from his stall, ears forward with interest. Though his eyes were bright and alert, Jacob noticed how the horse leaned against the wall for support, his legs trembling slightly. Still, Hero nickered softly at each new arrival, as if greeting old friends. The sense of community wrapped around Jacob like a warm blanket. He hadn't experienced anything like this since his military days. People shared stories as they worked, laughed together, and treated his property like a second home. For the first time in years, the lonely edges of his life felt softer. As the sun began to set, Jacob walked Ethan to his bike. The boy lingered, glancing back at the barn. "Mr. Jacob?" Ethan's voice was quiet. "Will Hero be okay for the event? He seems really tired today." Jacob's throat tightened. He placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Hero's strong, son. He'll do his best for us, just like he always has." After Ethan pedaled away, Jacob returned to the barn. Hero's soft breathing filled the quiet space. Jacob stood beside the horse, running his hand along the familiar neck. "I just want to give you the send-off you deserve," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. The morning sun had barely risen when Jacob heard unusual sounds from the barn. He rushed out, still in his pajamas and work boots, to find Hero struggling to stand. The old horse's legs trembled beneath him, and his breathing came in labored huffs. "Easy there, old friend," Jacob murmured, his heart racing as he supported Hero's weight. It took nearly 15 minutes to get the horse steady on his feet. When Jacob offered Hero's morning feed, the horse just turned his head away. Jacob's hands shook as he dialed the vet's number. Dr. Martinez arrived within the hour, her face grave as she examined Hero. "His condition is deteriorating faster than we expected," she said softly. "He may only have days left, Jacob. He needs constant monitoring now." Jacob nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. After the vet left, he sat on a hay bale, head in his hands, when he heard the familiar sound of Ethan's bicycle. "Mr. Jacob?" Ethan's voice wavered as he took in the scene. "What's wrong with Hero?" Jacob explained the situation gently, then added, "Maybe we should cancel the event. Hero's not strong enough." "No!" Ethan's sudden outburst echoed through the barn. "We can't cancel. Hero deserves this. He deserves to have everyone know how special he is." Tears welled in the boy's eyes. "Please, Mr. Jacob." Looking at Ethan's determined face, Jacob felt his resolve strengthen. "You're right, son. Hero deserves this." They spent the rest of the day caring for Hero. Jacob brushed the horse's coat until it shone, speaking softly about their shared memories. "Remember that time in Kosovo," he whispered. "You carried 3 wounded men to safety that day." Hero's ears twitched at Jacob's voice, and he managed to eat a few bites of hay. That night, Jacob fell into an exhausted sleep in his recliner. In his dreams, he was young again, riding Hero through a war-torn landscape. The horse moved with powerful grace, muscles rippling as he galloped. Gunfire exploded around them, but Hero never faltered, carrying Jacob safely through the chaos. Jacob woke with tears streaming down his face, the dream still vivid in his mind. He wiped his eyes and looked out the window toward the barn, where Hero's nightlight glowed softly. The event would happen, he decided. Hero would have his moment of recognition, even if it was his last. The morning of the event dawned clear and crisp. Cars lined the gravel driveway as people arrived, carrying flowers and old military photographs. The small property buzzed with energy as veterans in their service caps mingled with families and neighbors. Ethan darted between groups, his face flushed with excitement. "This way to Hero's stall," he called out, leading curious visitors to meet the guest of honor. "He saved soldiers in the war," he explained proudly to anyone who would listen. In the barn, Jacob's hands trembled as he prepared Hero. Each brushstroke was gentle, methodical. He polished the brass on Hero's bridle until it gleamed and carefully draped the decorated cavalry blanket over the horse's back. The blanket was adorned with Hero's medals and ribbons, telling the story of his service. "Ready, old friend," Jacob whispered, leading Hero toward the barn doors. As they emerged into the sunlight, a hush fell over the crowd. Hero, though thin and gray with age, held his head high. His eyes, still bright and alert, surveyed the gathering. Someone in the crowd sniffled, and another person began to clap softly. Jacob mounted carefully, settling into the familiar saddle. Ethan took his position beside them, gripping the lead rope with determination. The parade began slowly, Hero's hooves clicking steadily against the packed earth of the driveway. The crowd parted, forming an honor guard of sorts. Veterans saluted as Hero passed, while children waved small American flags. Despite his weakness, Hero maintained a dignified pace, each step measured and purposeful. Jacob could feel the old horse gathering his strength, channeling the warrior spirit that had carried them through battlefields years ago. Halfway through the procession, Jacob noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. His heart seemed to stop as he recognized the familiar figure. Maggie stood there, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her father and Hero pass by. Their eyes met, and Jacob felt years of distance and hurt suspended in that single moment. Hero, as if sensing the weight of the reunion, drew himself up even taller, his ears pricked forward. The old war horse stood proud and strong, a living bridge between past and present, father and daughter. As the parade ended and the applause faded, Maggie stepped forward from the crowd, still holding her wildflowers. Her steps were hesitant as she approached Jacob, who had just dismounted from Hero. Ethan hung back near the fence, watching intently as father and daughter faced each other. "Dad," Maggie said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry it's been so long." She glanced at Hero, who stood quietly beside Jacob. "Sarah from the sanctuary. She told me about Hero. I couldn't believe it when she said you'd taken him in." Jacob's weathered face softened. "Maggie, No, please," she interrupted, wiping her eyes. "Let me say this. Seeing you today with Hero, caring for him like this, it reminded me of the dad I used to know, the one who taught me to ride, who told me stories about his brave war horse." They stood in silence for a moment, years of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Jacob reached out and pulled his daughter into a tight embrace. Hero nickered softly beside them, as if approving the reunion. As they pulled apart, Maggie noticed Ethan shifting uncertainly nearby. "Is this your helper I've heard about?" she asked, smiling at the boy. Jacob beckoned Ethan over. "This is Ethan. He's been helping me care for Hero." Pride filled his voice as he added, "He's got a natural way with horses." Ethan beamed at the praise, and Maggie's eyes grew misty again. "Dad, what you've done here, it's amazing. Not just for Hero, but for everyone. These veterans, this community, and especially for Ethan." She touched her father's arm. "I'm so proud of you." The afternoon crowd began to thin, leaving behind a peaceful quiet. Jacob led Hero back to his stall, his steps slow and careful. The old horse seemed tired, but content after his big day. "Dad," Maggie said, following them into the barn, "let me stay tonight, help with Hero. We have so much to catch up on." Jacob nodded, emotion catching in his throat. They settled on hay bales near Hero's stall, and Ethan joined them, cross-legged on the floor. As the evening light filtered through the barn windows, they shared stories, Maggie about her life in the city, Ethan about his adventures with Hero, Jacob filling in the gaps of lost years. Hero stood quietly in his stall, ears twitching as he listened to their voices. His presence seemed to fill the barn with peace, bringing together 3 generations in a moment of healing that none of them had expected. The morning after the parade dawned gray and quiet. Jacob found Hero lying down in his stall, something unusual for the old war horse. When he finally coaxed Hero to his feet, the horse's legs trembled with effort, and his breathing came in shallow pants. "I'll call the vet," Maggie said softly, placing a hand on her father's shoulder. Ethan arrived shortly after, his face falling when he saw Hero's condition. "Is he okay?" he asked, his voice small. Jacob shook his head slowly. "He's tired, son. The parade took a lot out of him." They spent the morning taking turns sitting with Hero, making sure he had fresh water and encouraging him to eat small bites of hay. The usual busy sounds of the barn were replaced by hushed voices and the gentle rustle of straw. By afternoon, Jacob settled onto his familiar hay bale beside Hero's stall. Maggie and Ethan sat nearby, watching as Jacob gently stroked Hero's neck. The horse's eyes, though weary, remained fixed on his old friend. "You know," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion, "Hero wasn't just any cavalry horse. During the war, when things got really bad, he never wavered." He paused, collecting himself. "There was this one night, shells exploding everywhere. Most horses would have bolted, but not Hero. He stood steady while we loaded wounded soldiers onto his back." Ethan leaned forward, hanging on every word. Maggie wiped tears from her eyes as her father continued. "He saved more lives than anyone could count. But it wasn't just about bravery." Jacob's hand moved steadily along Hero's neck. "It was about loyalty, trust. He taught me what it meant to never give up on someone." As evening approached, Hero's breathing became more labored. He lowered himself to the straw-covered floor of his stall, a movement that made Jacob's heart clench. Without a word, he retrieved a wooden box from the tack room. Inside were Hero's cavalry medals, still shining after all these years. Jacob carefully placed them near Hero's head, along with the old cavalry blanket they'd used in the parade. The medals caught the dim light of the barn, glinting like stars. Maggie brought extra lanterns, setting them around the stall. Ethan sat cross-legged near Hero's head, occasionally reaching out to stroke his forelock. Jacob remained at Hero's side, one hand resting on the horse's shoulder, feeling each labored breath. As night settled in, they maintained their quiet vigil. The only sounds were Hero's breathing and the soft whisper of wind through the barn boards. None of them spoke much. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything that words couldn't. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the barn's weathered boards, casting long shadows across Hero's stall. The old war horse's breathing had grown shallow and irregular throughout the night. Jacob hadn't moved from his position, his hand still resting on Hero's graying mane, his fingers gently stroking the coarse hair. Maggie stood behind her father, one hand on his shoulder, while Ethan knelt on the other side of Hero. The boy's eyes were red from crying, but he remained silent, understanding the gravity of the moment. Hero's final breaths came softly, barely stirring the straw beneath his head. His dark eyes, still bright despite his failing body, stayed fixed on Jacob until the very end. When the last breath left him, it was as gentle as a whisper. Tears streamed down Jacob's weathered face as he leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Hero's neck one last time. After several minutes of heavy silence, Jacob slowly stood and walked out of the barn. The morning air was crisp and clean, but he barely noticed it through his grief. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Ethan, his young face streaked with tears. "Did—" Ethan's voice cracked. "Did it hurt him?" Jacob placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "No, son. Hero was at peace, surrounded by people who loved him. That's the best way to go." They decided to bury Hero in his favorite spot, near the sun-dappled pasture where he loved to graze. Word spread quickly through the community, and by mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered. Tom, Lisa, and other veterans stood in respectful silence as Jacob spoke about his faithful companion. "Hero wasn't just a war horse," Jacob began, his voice steady despite his grief. "He was a testament to courage, loyalty, and love. He saved countless lives during the war, but more than that, he saved souls, mine included. The gathered crowd listened intently as Jacob shared stories of Hero's bravery and kindness. When he finished speaking, Ethan stepped forward, clutching something in his hands. It was a small wooden horse he had carved himself, the details rough but lovingly crafted. With careful reverence, Ethan placed the carving on Hero's grave. "Thank you for teaching me about bravery," he whispered, stepping back to stand beside Jacob. The morning sun rose higher, warming the gathering of people who had come to say goodbye to a remarkable horse who had touched so many lives. In death, as in life, Hero had brought them all together. The quiet of the barn felt different now, weeks after Hero's passing. Jacob stood in the empty stall, running his hand along the worn wood where Hero used to rest his head. The loss still ached, but something else stirred in his heart, a sense of purpose that wouldn't let him sink into grief. Maggie had extended her stay, helping Jacob sort through old photos and memories. She sat at his kitchen table now, coffee cup in hand. "Dad, what Hero did for you, for Ethan, for everyone, it doesn't have to end." Ethan visited almost daily after school, often sitting with Jacob as they shared stories about Hero. The boy's presence had become a comfort, a reminder that life moved forward. "We could help more people," Maggie continued, spreading out some paperwork. Sarah from the sanctuary called. "They're looking for partners for their therapy programs." Jacob nodded slowly, remembering how Hero had brought healing to so many. He thought about Tom, Lisa, and the other veterans who had found peace in Hero's presence. "Hero's legacy," he said quietly. "That's what we'll call it." Over the next few days, Jacob threw himself into planning. He cleared space in the barn for more animals, working with the sanctuary to identify gentle creatures suited for therapy work. A brass plaque appeared on the barn wall, bearing Hero's name and the simple words, "In honor of a warrior who taught us about healing, hope, and the power of unconditional love." The first therapy session brought 3 veterans and 2 children to the farm. Jacob watched as Ethan confidently showed them how to approach the animals: a gentle donkey, 2 retired police horses, and a calm therapy dog. The boy's voice was steady as he shared what Hero had taught him about trust and patience. "Take it slow," Ethan instructed a nervous young girl, guiding her hand to stroke the donkey's soft nose. "That's how Mr. Johnson taught me with Hero." Jacob stood back, watching as the participants began to relax around the animals. A veteran with trembling hands grew still while brushing one of the horses. A withdrawn child started to smile as the therapy dog nuzzled his hand. The barn filled with quiet conversation and occasional laughter, sounds of healing that reminded Jacob so much of Hero's gentle presence. Maggie appeared at his side, slipping her arm through his. "He'd be proud, Dad," she whispered. "Hero's still helping people, through you." Jacob felt it then, not the sharp pain of loss, but a warm certainty that Hero's spirit lived on in every person who found comfort within these barn walls. The old horse had shown them all the way, and now it was their turn to carry his legacy forward. The spring morning brought a gentle warmth to the pasture as Jacob walked alongside Maggie and Ethan. The property had transformed remarkably over the past months. Where there was once silence, now came the soft nickering of horses, bleating of therapy goats, and cheerful voices of visitors. The grass was worn in paths between the new paddocks and therapy areas, signs of the life that now filled the space. "I've been thinking," Jacob said, pausing to watch a group of veterans working with one of the rescue horses. "We could add more programs, maybe work with the local schools." His voice held a confidence that had been missing for years. Maggie squeezed his arm. "The waiting list is already growing. Sarah called yesterday. She has 3 more animals that would be perfect for therapy work." Ethan bounced ahead of them, pointing to a new fenced area. "We could build another shelter there, Mr. Johnson." I could help after school, like I did with Hero's stall." "You're here so much already, might as well put you to work," Jacob teased, ruffling the boy's hair. They reached the crest of the small hill overlooking the property. Maggie cleared her throat. "Dad, I've been meaning to tell you something. I've decided to stay, permanently. I've already started looking at houses in town." Jacob turned to his daughter, emotion catching in his throat. The distance between them had melted away these past months, replaced by a deeper understanding. "The program needs both of us," she continued, "and I need this too. Being here, helping people, it feels right." Ethan looked between them, grinning. "Really? You're staying?" When Maggie nodded, he hugged her impulsively. Then he turned to Jacob, his eyes serious. "You know, you and Hero changed my life. I mean it. Before, I felt lost. But now..." Jacob understood. He felt it too. The sense of purpose that had grown from his grief, the healing that came from helping others heal. As evening approached, Jacob settled into his porch chair, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft oranges and pinks. A newly rescued horse grazed peacefully in the pasture, its coat catching the fading light. Near the fence, Hero's grave was marked by Ethan's carved wooden horse and fresh spring flowers. The screen door creaked as Maggie stepped out, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She handed one to her father and sat beside him, both of them content in the comfortable silence they'd learned to share. Ethan's laughter rang out as he ran past, one of the therapy dogs bounding playfully at his heels. The sight brought a smile to Jacob's face. He looked toward Hero's grave, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. "Thank you, Hero," he whispered, the words carrying on the evening breeze. If you enjoyed the story of Hero, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.